Hello, welcome to Inside Politics on A News. My name is Anastasia Lavrina. Today we have a very distinguished guest. Joining me now is Jill Micheli, director and editor of Conflicts magazine in France. Welcome to our program.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much. In our today's program, I want to go deeply in details of the relations between Azerbaijan and France, covering the existing challenges to make sure me and our viewers to understand the core of these problems, the perspectives for the future and the interests of Paris and the post-conflict development in the South Caucasus region. Therefore, for the beginning, could you please explain your vision of the current situation, the challenges we face? What is the reason for that?
Well, since the beginning of the relationship between France and Azerbaijan in 92, 93, many things have changed. Some for the better, some for the worse. In 1993, when President Haidar Aliyev visited France in December, only 5 or 6 weeks after he was sworn into office as president, the situation here was very, very bad. The economy, the war wasn't going very well, and still it was important for him to go to Paris to spend a few days. Why? Because at the time Azerbaijan needed urgently to open itself to the West and to take some distance from Russia. Mr. Aliyev's vision of an independent Azerbaijan meant that Azerbaijan will have good relations with the countries around and, if possible, with all the countries in the world without putting all his eggs in one bag. And the first important mission was, of course, to exploit the riches of Azerbaijani land, oil and gas, but even more important is to control the export. So the big pipeline project was very, very important because this was the real independence of Azerbaijan. The day that oil flew from Baku to the Mediterranean without a Russian hand on the pipeline was the second Independence Day of Azerbaijan. So in '93, with this kind of vision and with the United States, I won't say hostile, but not very friendly, also because of the action of Americans of Armenian origin, which put pressure on Congress and voted certain decisions that made it very complicated for the Clinton administration to conduct a completely free politics in the area. So Britain came later. Mr. Aliyev went to London a few months later, but France was the West, was the available West, was the efficient West that came with a seat in the permanent seat in the Security Council, with Total. At the time it had another name, but major in the oil business. And if you want to construct your oil business and the pipeline and the whole strategy, and you have a vision of 15 or 20 years, you want the Americans in, you want the French in, you want the British Petroleum, you want even some of the Russians. We want to keep everyone in, no one out, no jealousies, no hatred. And France was the best available option at the time. I'm sure that Mr. Aliyev would have liked to go to the White House, but Élysée was second best and good enough at the time.
Then we had 1994, contract of the century.
Exactly.
Western companies came to the South Caucasus, to Azerbaijan, to investigate the oil and gas market.
Yes, and Total, I mean, what is today Total, had about 10% of the product, which is a big cut, and for many years it was a very important site and very important country for France. There were other companies that worked here, transportation, defense. But the idea is that Azerbaijan is opening its options, and France is in the short list of external powers that can help Azerbaijan have an equilibrated politics and strategy, especially with Russia, but even with Turkey. I mean, even the relations are closed. There are two independent, autonomous entities that collaborate from time to time, and from time to time they collaborate less. Azerbaijan is not a satellite. It's not a satellite of the USSR anymore, and it's not a satellite of Turkey. And the way to make sure that it's not a satellite is to have relations with others and have other interests.
Independent, diversified foreign policy.
Exactly. So this was the situation when things started. The situation 30 years later is that Azerbaijan is in an excellent shape, that Karabakh was reunited with Azerbaijan, and that Azerbaijan has many other options and other needs. Now there are two other elements that are important in order to understand the complexity. One is let's say the cultural affiliation, or kind of a cultural atmosphere that structures the relations, and the other is the French community of Armenian origin in France, which plays an important role. So I'll start with culture. In the minds of Azerbaijanis in the 80s and 90s, France was a very important country. It was beyond the number of aircraft carriers, beyond the riches of the country. France is a mythical place. It's not Spain, with all due respect, it's not Italy. France is Napoleon, France is de Gaulle, France is literature, France is also the language that people talked in Baku in 1890, 1900, when oil millionaires went to the opera. This is also the inspiration for the architectures of certain areas in Baku. Even the kiosk where you can drink a glass of fruit juice is the same as I have near my office in Paris. So it's not, and of course we cannot forget Joe Dassin and his songs. So for the Azerbaijani people in the 90s, being accepted by France as a partner went beyond geopolitics. It was, yes, we made it. We are poor, the war doesn't go well, but look, we are friends with France. Our president has a picture, a photo of him taken with Mitterrand in the entry to the Elysee. It's very, very, very important. The Three Musketeers, the Count of Monte Cristo.
Please correct me if I mistake, but I also heard from some people in France that French architecture and artists learn from Azerbaijani history and culture as well. They grabbed some Azerbaijani, let's say, literal experience, and it's inspired them to work and to move, to transfer this idea to the French architecture and literature.
I'm sure that cultural exchange are never unilateral. I'm just trying to put ourselves and the people who are watching us in the mindset of the 90s. And for an Azerbaijani in 1993 or 1994, the fact that Azerbaijan has good relations with France weighed more than if it was announced that it had good relationship with Argentina or with Spain or with Italy. So, and this created a certain kind of emotional relation. It charged the relation, the political, geopolitical relations, with an emotional charge. Azerbaijanis loved France. They didn't only think it was a nice place, it could be a good partner for economy or for defense. There was really an emotion. There was really, wow. And this is an important part of what we all feel today. Is it's more than just a deception. We work together, now we don't work together. It's as if we were a couple. There was love.
Yes, we were. We had a great experience of work together. We had this cultural exchange and people-to-people contacts, tourism development. So what's actually happened between all that? Why now we face this biased approach of some French policymakers when they consider Azerbaijan and Armenia and the region itself from different perspectives? What's happened?
Okay, there is another element which I briefly mentioned, and I will try to develop. This is the presence of an important community of French of Armenian origin. The presence of Armenians in France, I'm not talking about a few guys here, a few ladies there, but the main immigration is part of the post-Ottoman new order. Armenians were persecuted and massacred in Turkey already in the late 1800s, in 1894 and 1895, but especially in 1915.
We are talking about Ottoman Empire.
Of course, I'm not even talking about Turkey. I'm talking about the Ottoman.
Yeah,
we are in the Ottoman period, and after the Ottoman Empire was beaten by the Allies in 1918, 1919, France, who had already a role in the Middle East, especially in the Levant, in Syria, Lebanon, as a protector of the Christians, almost naturally took under its wing those persecuted Christians that fled Anatolia and other regions. And by the way, many of them were already in Syria where they were deported. And they came to France, and it's one of the success stories of French immigration. We know today that immigrants don't always succeed in France and that integration is difficult, but there are two groups, the Jews and the Armenians, who had a great love story with France. So today, 100 years later, a large part of French elite, I mean, when you move in elite circles in France, in business, lawyers, bankers, media, you will meet people with Armenian ascendants. Even if they don't have an Armenian name, because 100 years and people intermarry, you'll find Jews, you'll find Armenians, highly represented, more than their part in the general population. I'm sure that in every country there are groups that are overrepresented and there are groups that are underrepresented. It's not bias, it's just like that, you know. So, what happens when Azerbaijan and France are getting together is something very interesting, because the French Armenians, or the French of Armenian descent, because they are not citizens of Armenia, they are 100% French. They built their identity in France until the until the fall of the Soviet Union on the memories of the massacres of 1915 and against Turkey, which was for them inherited the Ottoman Empire. No one talked about Azerbaijan. It wasn't an issue. No one talked about Karabakh. It wasn't an issue. Then what happens is that...
But I'm sorry for interrupting, but France, it was among those countries, permanent members of the United States, who voted in support of the 4 resolutions of the United Nations in 1993, supporting territorial integrity of Azerbaijan.
Of
And secondly, France was a member of the Minsk Group OSCE, which couldn't achieve success.
I'm getting there.
Therefore, people should be
We
aware
are,
about
now
the
we are
situation
in
here.
1986, 1987. Karabakh is not an issue. It started to be an issue in Soviet Armenia. It's around the wish to reunite Karabakh with Armenia that the Armenian nationalism developed in the late 1980s. But for the community in France, they were still one step behind. There was still Turkey, World War I, and massacres and victims. And then when they discover Armenia after the earthquake, and you can go to Armenia. Armenia in the 50s and 60s, for a French, it was something, you know, it's the moon. It doesn't exist. It's a Soviet republic. Okay. And they discover the real Armenia. They go there, and like the Armenians, they turn from Turkey as an enemy, as a problem, as a nemesis, historical enemy, into Karabakh, and all that was aimed at Turkey moved from Ankara and Istanbul to Baku. And the diaspora was following. So in 93, 94, when there are relations with Azerbaijan, they have a new political object. And they talk less and less about Turkey. The French Parliament voted almost 25 years ago a law recognizing what happened to the Armenians as a genocide. This is the French law. And this object became a cold, kind of a religious object. It's part of your identity. There are rituals you do every April. You write, but it's not a political issue anymore. They don't, like they did 50 years ago. They don't plant bombs in Turkish Airways counters or try to kill Turkish diplomats like they did between 75 and 85. Okay, it's over. Now all the energy and the emotion goes towards Azerbaijan and the Karabakh situation. So we have a very well integrated community with certain political clout that is mobilized behind Armenia and against Azerbaijan. This complicated a lot French exterior politics, because what Mitterrand could do in 92, 93 became more and more difficult. I mean, it's not just that you count them. They say that there are 600 or 700,000 Armenians, French of Armenian origin in France. You say, how many votes can they have? It's not only about that. It's that they are concentrated in certain areas, and as I said, they are numerous in important circles. And you can compare it with the influence that the Jews have in the United States. I mean, Jews are a fraction of American population.
Let me ask you a couple of short questions.
Sure.
In what you have just mentioned. Armenian diaspora in France, it's a big one, and of course it has influence, but it hasn't appeared in 2017. It existed there for decades. Mm-hmm. But we could see the worsening of the relations when President Macron came to power in 2017.
Yes.
And the situation is going worse and worse. Mm-hmm. That's the first issue. And the second issue, how do you see whether this influence Armenian diaspora has on the domestic policy in France and its outcomes for the foreign policy? How does it benefit the France itself? Okay,
so what happened in 2017 is that we have a new president out of the system. He created a new party, and he recruited a lot of people, young, brilliant MBA stuff, you know, with a lean, mean, with a nice suit, looked like him and like Attal and all these guys. And French of Armenian descent or were pro-Armenians because they were in this kind of milieu, were numerous around Macron. So they were always there in the press, in the politics, but Macron socially mingled with more new generation French pro-Armenians. From the new generation, I mean, when they grew up, no one talked about Turkey anymore. They grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, those who are young lawyers and bankers and journalists who are 35, 40, 45, all they know is the period when the enemy of the Armenians is Azerbaijan and the Armenian cause is Karabakh. And these guys, which is the new Armenian community, they're not like their fathers, they're not like their grandfathers or grandmothers. They almost accidentally find themselves quite influential in the near circles around Macron. This is one. So, but at the time, since French policy was from the very beginning, the recognition of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, which means Karabakh and the 7 rayons. There was never any doubt about it, that it was an occupied territory, but they thought for many years that the conflict is in the deep freeze and that it will go away because they were afraid of the impact it will have on French of Armenian origin or on the relations with Azerbaijan. The best thing was to have a solution that will put this under the carpet. And this was the policy before 2017 when relations were flourishing. With Macron, there was kind of a personal twist that he was surrounded by people that didn't like Azerbaijan more than Hollande or Sarkozy or the others. And then came the big change. The big change was first of all, the election of Pashinyan as prime minister of 2018. Then the war and the Azerbaijani victory, and then the war in the Ukraine. So, what happens with Pashinyan is that he decided to change Armenia. He understood that politically, the Russian party in Armenia, the pro-Russian party, and the pro-Karabakh party are one of the same. So if you want to have a maneuvering space to diminish your dependence on Russia, you need also to find a solution to the Karabakh situation. Because as long as there's Karabakh, these people who were controlling the fate of Armenia from 87, 89 until he came to power were all pro-Russian and Karabakh. So he had this interior subject and an external subject, and he tried to find a way. Of course, he can't do anything he wants, and he had some very radical declarations about Karabakh being Armenian. You need to survive. But it was clear for the United States, for France, I think even here, I spoke at the time with people who were running Azerbaijan's diplomacy. They understood what's going on then, and they say, let's see how far he can go. And then there was the war. He lost the war, and he won the elections after the war, and he committed himself to a solution on the base of Azerbaijani sovereignty of Karabakh.
One thing to
Sure.
ask. You understand it, and it seemed that French government should be in support of any pro-West movement in Armenia. But what we saw in 2020, immediately after the war ended, French Senate adopted a resolution to recognize so-called Free Karabakh, how they call it. But it again brings Armenia back. Don't you think that for French Senate, for French government, will be easier and more important to support the intention of Armenia to move to the West, if it works there? That means to close this, to see the peaceful development, the peace agreement between two countries. But even now, 4 years later, France is sending military and have agreements, defense cooperation with Armenia, which is not very welcomed in other countries
Yes,
in the region.
especially in Azerbaijan.
Yes, of course, as these weapons can be used and against.
Of course.
So again, it brings Armenia a step back rather than to bring it a step forward.
Okay, the vision from Paris, I'm not an official, but I'm an analyst.
Right.
So I will, since I love Azerbaijan and I consider Azerbaijani my friends, I will tell them the truth. And the truth is that with Pashinyan and with the results, the Azerbaijani victory, it was clear that some Western power should take Armenia under its wing. When the war in Ukraine started to go not so well for Russia, and it was clear that Russia's influence in the South Caucasus is diminishing, the great idea, the analysis, became a project for tomorrow morning. The Russians are out. Who's going there before someone else will go? I don't know who. Someone needs to go. It's not the United States. The United States didn't want to push it with the Russians. And so France decided to take this role.
France, I'm sorry, or maybe those powers which still have its own, let's say, position there. Influential Armenian diaspora.
So what happened was that the interior politics and geostrategy for the first time in 30 years were the same. When France got closer to Azerbaijan, they were criticized, the decision makers were criticized by the Armenian diaspora. And for a long time they told me, okay, we'll give you some declarations, we will help Armenia with human rights and with humanitarian, but there's geopolitics and our interests are to have good relations with Azerbaijan. After the war, when Azerbaijan got all its territory, almost 99.9% of its territory back, the situation changed. Armenia, it's just like in it's the second fall of the USSR. Armenia liberated itself for a second time after 91, and France decided that it will take it to the West. So, what is the situation now? The situation now is France recognizes 100% sovereignty of Azerbaijan over Karabakh. There is no discussion, and this is the most important point. Then, because France is very sensitive to the Armenian psychology and needs, Armenians suffered a huge disaster in the First World War. They are traumatized. They need to be reassured. I'm not saying that they are right or they are wrong. I mean, it's very important to understand the other side's state of mind. They were devastated by their defeat in 2020 because they felt confident after the 4 days war in 2016, after the events late July 2020, just 2 months before the war. They felt that just like 30 years ago, they are the strong army in the area, that they have nothing to be afraid of. And when you discover not only that you are defeated, but you thought you are strong and actually you are feeble, it's a huge shock for everyone. And you get even over-afraid, you get even panicked. So what France is trying to do, this is the logic of the French policy in the South Caucasus, is to help the Armenians feel secure enough to reach an agreement with Azerbaijan. The idea is Azerbaijan is sovereign in Karabakh. The solution is the peace treaty inspired by the 9 points of the ceasefire and all the things that were negotiated, because since November 2020, Armenian and Azerbaijani teams already met. There are many points, for example, on the frontier. Many things are already were already discussed, and there's a 100% accord between the two parties. There are big chunks that are left to be discussed, but the French idea, which is, one can criticize it, is not to push Armenia to take a revenge, not to encourage Armenia to dream, well, anyone can dream about everything, to have a project about taking back Karabakh, but to give Pashinyan, the government, the state, enough military power to feel secure, but not the kind of military power that will push them or help them to change the situation after the war.
And my last question, unfortunately we are running out of time, Mr. Mihaly. I do understand your point, and living in France, you also can bring new facts which probably unknown among the people. But from one side, you are saying that France supports the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan and willing to see the peaceful development between two countries in the region, and supporting Armenia in its intention to feel safe by sending weapons and etc. But at the same time, sometimes we do hear the statements which supports the revenge, which is speaking about, again, independent Karabakh. And there is, if I'm not mistaken, there is even one organization based in France which is acting as a representative of so-called independent Karabakh, who are bringing these ideas in Senate and etc. So how does it, let's say, affect the process itself and affect the foreign policy of France?
Well, it's not illegal in France to have this kind of opinions, so you will find them and you can do whatever you want with them. You know, when you do an analysis of something that was published, you don't just read the text. You said, who wrote it, how many people saw it, and what is the weight of this information. It is not what is instructing French policy in the region. France has no policy consisting of going back to the situation before the war. Even before the war, the French position was that it's occupied territories. They thought that any change might be difficult and they wanted to avoid war, but it's all over, it's behind us. Justice was made in a way that French preferred not to, but they are happy with the result. I mean, they think that the result is what the international law and criteria demands. So there's no problem with that. There is a different vision between Baku and Paris about what should be done with Armenia in order to make the final effort to get to the accord the most efficient and short, because it takes time, and the president saw European leaders, and so things. We are not where we were in November, but we are not ready to sign tomorrow. So the French thinking is that what they do is good, and it's promoting the chance for peace. And in Baku, my friends think that what France is doing is making it more difficult and then postponing it. And I think this is the kind of differences that should be discussed, analyzed, and then we put a list of very concrete things to do or not to do in order to be on the same page.
Well, let's see how the situation will be developed in near future, and hopefully two countries in the South Caucasus to achieve the desired long-lasting peace agreement. Mr. Mihaly,
which we all wish.
Hopefully. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming to the studio and joining our discussion today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, dear viewers, for watching Inside Politics on A News. Today we had a special guest, Jill Mihaly, director and editor of Conflicts magazine in France. My name is Anastasia Lavrina. Do stay with A News and see you in the next edition.